Welcome to a new episode of Mystic-Skeptic Radio's Uncensored. Today we have a special guest. Her name is Meghan Allen. She's doing her master's at this time, and she can tell us a little bit about her background. But the topic is her thesis, which is called Transforming Expectations, Analyzing Mexican American Women's Connections to Culture as Transferred by Maternal Figures. Um, Megan and I were talking before the show about how I went to an artist retreat, and instead of talking of a father's wound or having daddy issues, a lot of the artists were talking about how their relationships with their mothers were very um, dicey. And I had a different situation when my mom was younger, but now that she's older, it has become a little difficult. So we discuss different things that happen in relation to a cultural background as Mexican Americans or me being a first generation immigrant from Mexico. So if you can tell us about your school, your interest in this project, and how is it tied into the different books from, would you call them Chicano literary figures, or are they going by Mexican American at this time? It's depending on what writer we're talking about.
Yes, thank you so much. So it does typically depend on what the writer prefers as their label to identify them. The literary study is referred to as Chicano slash literary studies, and it's grounded in primarily theorists such as Gloria Anzaldúa and Shadi Moraga, but it also takes from other literary figures such as Audre Lorde, Judith Butler, Adrienne Rich. There's various, it takes a lot of other figures. So that's the nice thing about Chicano literature is that, or excuse me, Chicano literary studies, is that it pulls from a bunch of different areas of literary studies, combining a lot of the theory about that identity marginalization and the history of what that means to identity in America. But a little bit about myself. Yes, thank you. My name's Megan, and I'm currently about to be receiving my master's degree in English with the focus on Chicano studies. And I wrote my thesis on maternal transference of culture and how those cultural expectations, such as the gender roles and the cultural roles for the women, typically determine how that culture gets transferred, either positively or negatively. And then a little bit about my background is was born and raised in Houston, Texas. My mother is a Mexican woman. She is a second generation Mexican American. And my great great grandparents immigrated from Mexico to Texas. And a lot of my culture as a Mexican American woman was not transferred to me through my mother because, in my theory, she has negative experiences with it through her own gender expectations from the culture or the patriarchal expectations for women in the culture. So I'm looking to refine my way back to the culture while appreciating the indigenous roots and acknowledging my mother's experience as a woman in Mexican American culture as it translates to intergenerational trauma, which of course would be passed down the line to me as her daughter. So that's what really led me to this project. Was It was truly actually Shadi Moraga's memoir titled Native Country of the Heart, where which I believe she published in 2019. And she published it to create a testimonial for her mother's experience along with her own. And it creates this collective dynamic text that speaks to the multifaceted experience of being a Mexican American as it is a new contemporary experience with the changing social ideologies.
Well, for those who are not familiar with Chicano studies, I can tell you that I joined a group on Facebook and I told them, can you explain to me what a Chicano is? Because coming from Mexico, a lot of these terms we haven't been exposed to them, and we have our own alienation for not being up to par with what's been going on with the immigrants or even the native Texans and Americans who were here and got wrapped up in the colonies and in the new country. So, people have paranoia about immigrants, especially if they don't look European. When I think I've had people tell me, the border crossed us because they were here originally, or they were part of the colonial folks that were here before the U.S. became uh, I guess you call it a European country. They came from Spain or something else. So, and then the aspect of generational trauma and assimilation is interesting to me because one thing that I experienced coming from Mexico was that there was a lot of negative uh, cultural things that I wanted to dispose of. And I felt maybe similar to your ancestors that um, somehow American culture, either because of its values or because of its freedom to, uh, kind of put away your individual cultural components, that you can be part of a bigger culture that supposedly sees you as part of the melting pot, but if you look different, you will always be the other.
Yes, yes. So exactly as you just said, assimilation in Chicano studies, which I will work to define in just a moment, is they refer to it as a trap. They refer to it as a trap of assimilation because, as you said, there's always, if you're not white and male in this Anglo-centric patriarchal society of America, then you are going to be marginalized in some way, whether that's as a woman, whether that's as a Mexican individual, a black person, or and even you could get into sexuality, you can be marginalized by your sexuality. So, the Anglo-centric ideology of America as it was transferred from Europe back in the history when, the Europeans came over to America and conquered it. And then, yes, as you said too, the border crossed us. Texas was, in a lot of Chicano people's opinions, or not Chicano people's, but there is opinions that Texas is stolen land, and that it is not land that was politically or ethically, gained by America. And so overnight, Mexicans living in Texas became Americans, but they were still Mexican, but they had to be American. So it's this conflict, it's an internal conflict with, you're in a country that expects you to be a certain way. It expects you to speak English. Oh, you're in America, you need to be speaking English. Whenever they're asking you to, you know, they want you to assimilate, but they won't give you complete access to everything that, if you were to fully assimilate, you would think you would acquire, because it's about the ideological viewpoint of seeing those differences, noticing those differences, and acknowledging them as different, as not normal, or as not perfect, as not admirable. And so I think that a lot of that has to go into my mother's trauma with it, is that she most likely, and there's a lot that am still in the dark about with my mother. She hasn't shared a lot, but I get snippets time from time, and I can see the, you know reflection of the trauma that she's been through, and how it is now imprinted onto herself as an individual, and how it carried her mindset through the years. And so it really becomes this problem of trying to figure out where you, quote unquote, belong. Because too, it's if you try to assimilate an American culture, you're probably going to still be seen as an outsider. But even if you try to go back to your Mexican roots, you can still be, seen as not being Mexican enough. You live in America, you have these Americanized views of things. So therefore, you're no longer Mexican enough. So if you can't be American and you can't be Mexican, then what can you be? And that's really where that Chicano label comes into play. So uh, the term Hispanic is another widely used term to describe Mexican American populations and communities, but it's a politicized term that was created in order to track the amount of Mexican Americans in America as they were coming in during, I believe it was the 60s and 70s during the census. So this whole new term Hispanic was created to account for them, and it's it's referred to by the Chicano theorist as that colonizer term. Now it is in the efforts of being reclaimed, such as many other colonizer terms that you can see across other cultures. There's many terms that were used as derogatory or slanderous terms to designate a specific group that are now being reclaimed by that group and saying, this is who we are and we are proud to be this. It's no longer something that you can refer to and be negative. It's something that I have pride in, and it's something that means something to me. And so that Chicano term is to it's kind of, again, it's like a counterculture political term that is it's you are a second generation, you're a second or other generation that has, was born, you're born in America, you have Mexican descent, but you also have that internalized knowledge of that idea, like I was saying, that you don't fit in either places. So you create a new space for yourself, a space where you exist within the borders of Mexico and America. And it is a powerful thing to be able to claim that identity and say with pride, I am a Chicano, instead of following with the Anglo-centric term of Hispanic, which and many people don't even realize that that term was created to, account for the influx of Mexican Americans coming into America. And, while some people may not take offense to it, there are others. I speak again of Shari Moraga. She actually came to my university, Sam Houston State University, and she spoke, and she was very adamant about not being called Hispanic. She was not Hispanic. She was a Chicana, and that's what she wanted to be. And it's about aligning yourself with that movement, acknowledging the history of what America or what European history has done to these marginalized ethnic groups, and collectively coming together to be this power to fight against it. So that's what I really that's what I really find inspiration in, is I've come to learn all of these theories and all of these ideas about what it means to be a Chicana. And I too feel that questioning, where do I fit in? Because I reading Moraga's Native Country of the Heart truly made me realize that I am Chicana. I do have Mexican descent. My mother is Mexican. And as much as maybe she had tried to get me to erase it, and I don't even want to say that she wanted me to erase it, but I would say that she was okay with letting it go. And I think that that was because she saw America, or being American, as being better than being considered Mexican. But I don't see it that way, or more so that I see my Mexican identity as being just as important as the American side of my identity as well. Whereas it was not transferred to me from my maternal lineage, or at least from my direct maternal lineage. My grandmother still very much has that cultural aspect of her life, but it is not something that I have really taken the time to record properly. I do have cousins, which is something else that helped me realize the importance of this argument, is that I have cousins similar in age or very close in age who have shared experiences, not quite knowing where they fit along the spectrum, struggling with their mothers and understanding why their mothers taught them to be certain ways as women, and understanding that they were taught to be women a certain way by their mother. It's this huge maternal transmission of culture through generations that has brought myself, my cousins, and other Chicanas to where we are now, in the moment of time where we've come to realize that we have to acknowledge this past to be able to seek out a more diverse and represented future.
I want to talk about different terms that I've come across and how I view them. In Texas, and I guess the only other place I lived is Tennessee. I've heard the term Mexican being used as a derogatory term in the way that people say it. And maybe I'm paranoid, but being from Mexico, it's just funny that sometimes people would like bring it up out of the blue, like it's there's a thing about how do you identify yourself, and a thing about how people see you. So at one point, I I realized that some people make a big deal about where you're from, and I was trying to get away from that because I didn't want to be put on the spot. And I know for Mexican folks that might be a cowardly thing to do, to not be proud of being Mexican or wear it uh, in your lapel or whatever. But so that was one element. And then when the term Latinx came around, it felt like it was imposed by certain elements of the Latino community that felt disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if we're gonna go by how you define yourself, if it doesn't speak to you, if it's not something that you feel connected to, I would take the approach that if they want to call themselves Latinx, that's great. I have no problem with Latino or Latin or something like that. To me, it's always been weird because other than the Spanish language coming from the Latin, it doesn't make any sense. I would actually prefer Latin American, as acknowledging that all Spanish speaking and Portuguese speaking countries are part of the Americas. But
Mm-hmm.
regarding this aspect also of the patriarchy, um, I hold like a moderate view about, there's, we have to be honest about how, because of whatever was going on in history, it was usually the men that were in leadership. But there are some cultures where the women are in leadership, and both men and women can be horrible. So my caveat for the patriarchy would be like, is it a toxic patriarchy that demeans women and people who are not like them, or is it a just happened to be, or an ongoing leadership that was taken by the men for religious or cultural reasons, as compared to a destructive force as a patriarchy? Because we're assuming that all patriarchies are evil if we focus on them in a certain way. And I've actually been part of a very toxic um, matriarchy in my family, where the men were kind of pushovers and the women were causing a lot of harm and conflict. So I don't know if you have run into that in your studies of the Latinos, and not just in the U.S. but also in our home countries.
Yeah, so yeah, I do think that you made a good point about the fact that you shouldn't assume that all patriarchies are toxic. I think that coming from a woman's perspective, because I forgot to add in, it's not just Chicana theory that I look at, it's Chicana feminist theory that I look at. So as a woman, my perspective is a little bit biased, I feel, because of my gender identification. But a lot of the history of that, um, the gender expectation too, that has been implicated onto not just women, but men as well, again, stems from like we were saying, that history of, yes, it wasn't just the men who are in the ones who were, in political roles and battle and, making the financial decisions. It was the fact that religious doctrine also pushed the idea of men being the superior, figure in that gender dynamic. Now, as that translated into the Mexican culture, there are plenty of, matriarchal, matrilineal, indigenous tribes and, ethnic groups that exist, and there are plenty of matriarchal figures in the Mexican American or even indigenous, Latinx cultures that you can see. So the one that I focused on was La Malinche, and she is often regarded as the mother of all mestizos. And mestizo, if I'm remembering correctly, is a label to designate, the the like community or the group of indigenous, um, South American, Mexican, um, tribes with the European, Spanish, uh, you know, party. I apologize for not having a better definition. But yeah, so La Malinche is often regarded as the mother of all mestizos, and she was Hernan Cortez's, concubine. So she was his right hand woman, for lack of a better word. But a lot of what my research looks at is that she was a victim herself. She was sold into slavery, most likely to pay off, some sort of, agreement within her family. She was sold as a lot of times women were sold because they were sold for their sexual subservience. And so she was sold into slavery, and Cortez took her on as his concubine as he was, ravaging across Mexico, for the Spanish. And she was versed in Nahua, the Nahua language that the indigenous tribes spoke, and she served as translator for him. She also birthed one of his sons. But a lot of people see her as a traitor. So they see her as this figure, that this woman who betrayed her people. And so her as a figure also stands in comparison to another very important figure of, maternal figure of Mexican American culture, which is the Virgin of Mary. And so it's this dichotomy between Malinche, who a lot of Mexican Americans would look at as a traitor and a whore, and, someone that you don't want to be, or you're a virginal, chaste, subservient and dutiful wife. So it created this very hard image for women to be. They were either one of those two things. If they weren't one, they were the other. And so it was very hard, again, to find that balance between wanting to be a dutiful wife and uphold the expectations, of the culture for the the men, which, relates to, again, that patriarchal vision. And then, of course, as history just went on, that just became ingrained in the culture. And then when you compared it to American culture too, that became more of like that promised land. You could see how women in the 60s or the 70s in America were getting a lot more freedoms, and they were able to do more and have more, and it in comparison to the experiences of Mexican women seemed glamorous and desirable, even though there are still patriarchal and sexist expectations for women in America as well. As far as on the spectrum of those expectations go, American women they did have more freedoms than the Mexican women. So it really was those two figures, again, returning back to those two figures of La Malinche and the Virgin Mary, or the Virgin de Guadalupe. um they are these two embodiments of Mexican American feminine standards that have perpetuated that idea of what a woman should be. And, not just for women, but for men as well. It's not like women are the only ones who know these stories. Men know these stories as well. So that's another element of that perpetuation. Um, and I think that it's just this drastic change that we've seen over a short span of time, or at least over time, change is happening faster. I suppose that's a better way to say it. And it's becoming a changing dynamic to where it feels like we might be losing the culture by also losing those gender expectations. But I feel that culture does transform. And that's another part of what being a Chicana means, is that transformation is going to happen. And it's about understanding the elements that brought you to where you are now, and understanding the elements that continue to affect the future implications of this identity, of these identity roles.
Have you had a chance to see the movie from Scorsese, Children of the Flower Moon?
I have not had a chance to see that one yet. What's it about?
Um, so I don't know what state or city it is, but it's somewhere in the frontier. And there was a tribe that had an area, and they found oil. So the government or some company bought it from them, and they all received a pension. And it shows Native Americans being wealthy and having white chauffeurs and white servants, and then some fell in love and married some of the settlers, or I guess European Americans. And then one of the scam artists that lived around, he started poisoning them so he could, through different means, try to get those rights to him and his family. And I've only watched like 40 minutes of it, and it makes you angry. Like, it's hard to believe that I think it's based on a true story, that people can be that evil. And it's interesting, as I reflect on it, is that in American society, if you're not wealthy, you're not successful. So the only reason this movie was made is because it shows you Native Americans as successful entrepreneurs and wealthy. If they were poor, nobody would care. So the element of having limited means is uh, is something that affects Latinos back in the day and now. And I guess some of them, if they were ranchers or they joined the military or had a company or something like that, maybe they became wealthy. But does that ever come into the fore when you deal with these memoirs, that having limited resources, you can have freedom, you can have maybe some type of equality, being able to vote and have more access to things as a woman with a Latino background, but poverty and the lack of generational wealth, how does that play in the Chicano identity?
Oh, it absolutely plays a very critical element, because again, you look back to the financial relationship, or excuse me, the economic relationship between Mexico and America. as being this